Hey everyone, tonight we're diving deep into the hidden corridors of power, the unwritten diaries and the hushed-up scandals of medieval dynasties. Imagine candlelight flickering across heavy tapestries in a cold, stone room. You're a noble perhaps, or a servant, and you've just seen something you absolutely shouldn't have. Two figures close a shared glance, too long a touch that lingers. In this world, that fleeting moment, if spoken of, could unravel everything. Now, if you were actually there, in that medieval castle, and you saw what you just saw, and you opened your mouth about it, you probably won't survive this. Seriously, gossip could get you exiled, tortured, or worse. Discretion wasn't just a virtue, it was a life insurance policy, and a pretty flimsy one at that. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always cool to see how far these stories travel. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. You're walking down a long stone corridor, the air thick with the smell of damp wood smoke and something vaguely unwashed. It's the Middle Ages after all. Hygiene isn't exactly at its peak. Torches sputter in their sconces, casting dancing shadows that make every corner look like it's hiding a secret, or possibly a very large rat. Privacy, forget about it. You thought your roommate oversharing was bad. Try having a court full of gossips who consider your bowel movements primetime news. In this world of constant observation and intricate power plays, every word, every gesture is scrutinized. Dynasties are built on marriage alliances, on producing heirs, on the very public and very political act of creating the next generation to carry the family name and, more importantly, the family lands. Love in the romantic sense, we understand it is a luxury, often a dangerous one. Affection, deep connection, desire. These things certainly existed, but they had to navigate a landscape mined with social expectation, religious doctrine, and raw political ambition. Now imagine that the affection, the deep bond, the forbidden desire is for someone of the same sex. The stakes already sky high just rocketed into the stratosphere. We're talking about a time when the church held immense power, and its teachings on what constituted sin were becoming increasingly codified and enforced. The idea of a same-sex relationship, particularly for someone in a position of power, a king, a queen, a duke, wasn't just a personal failing, it was a potential dynastic catastrophe, an invitation for rivals to cry unnatural and a direct challenge to the established order of God and man. So these relationships, when they happened, were shrouded in layers of secrecy so thick you'd need a trebuchet to break through them. They existed in the spaces between the official records, in the loaded silences of chroniclers, in the venomous accusations of enemies, and sometimes, just sometimes, in the tender lines of a carefully worded letter or poem. Uncovering these stories is like trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle, where half the pieces are missing and the other half are written in invisible ink. You're sifting through chronicles often penned by monks who had their own agendas, perhaps to praise a patron, or more relevant to our topic, to utterly demolish the reputation of an enemy. Accusations of sodomy or unnatural vice were potent weapons. It's like a medieval Yelp review, 1 star, committed unspeakable acts, would not sin with again. But how much of it was truth and how much was politically motivated slander? That's the million-florin question. The language itself is a minefield. Medieval writers didn't have our modern vocabulary of sexual identity. They spoke of acts of sins against nature, of unmentionable deeds. When a king is described as having inordinate affection for a male favorite, or lavishing him with titles and wealth to the exclusion of other nobles, what are we really reading? Historians still debate whether the intense, emotional language used between some men in letters or chronicles truly signified erotic relationships or simply expressed deep platonic but culturally acceptable male bonding. The concept of amicitia perfecta, or perfect friendship, was a powerful ideal inherited from classical antiquity, allowing for expressions of love and devotion between men that might sound startlingly romantic to our modern ears. Think of David and Jonathan from the Bible, whose love was passing the love of women. This biblical example was often invoked a kind of acceptable framework for intense male bonds. But where did that idealized friendship end and a more physical romantic love begin? The lines are incredibly blurry, likely deliberately so. They weren't exactly texting eggplant emojis, you know. Discretion was key, like trying to sneak a cookie past your mum. The church, for its part, was becoming increasingly vocal and specific in its condemnations. Councils like the Third Lateran Council in 1179 laid down stricter rules and punishments for clerical incontinence, and also addressed lay morality, reinforcing the idea that certain sexual acts were outside the bounds of Christian behavior. This council, for instance, decreed that those engaging in that incontinence which is against nature should, if clergy, be expelled from their order and do penance in a monastery, and if laymen be excommunicated and segregated from the society of the faithful. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was a formal canonical condemnation, and it provided the theological and legal backbone for persecution. This increasing institutional disapproval meant that any hint of such relationships had to be buried even deeper. An odd little fact from this era is the sheer number of texts circulating about physiognomy, the art of judging character from outward appearance. Manuals would detail how a man with soft hands, or a high-pitched voice, or a gliding walk might be inclined towards effeminacy, and by extension, unnatural desires. Imagine the paranoia knowing that the way you carried yourself, the tone of your voice, could be interpreted by suspicious eyes as a sign of hidden sin. It's like being constantly on trial for your very mannerisms. These weren't scientific, of course, but they reflected a society obsessed with categorizing and identifying perceived deviance, making it even more perilous for those who didn't fit the rigid mold of masculine or feminine behavior. So you're navigating this treacherous world where your heart might pull you in a direction that society, the church, and quite possibly your own family would condemn with extreme prejudice. You learn to communicate in glances, in subtle favors, in coded words. Perhaps a shared interest in illuminated manuscripts becomes a pretext for spending hours together, or a hunting trip offers a rare moment of unchaperoned companionship. Every shared joke, every quiet conversation is freighted with unspoken meaning and potential danger. The silence surrounding these relationships in the historical record isn't necessarily proof of their absence. Rather, it's a testament to the immense pressure to conceal them. Our journey tonight is to listen carefully to those silences, to read between the lines of accusation and innuendo, and to try and catch the faint whispers of loves that dared not speak their name, especially when those names belonged to the crowned heads of medieval dynasties. The air is thick with secrets, and we're just beginning to peel back the layers. You're moving forward in time now, about a century after those early Norman conquerors first started making themselves uncomfortably at home in England. The heir in the royal court of William II, known to history as William Rufus, or William the Red, likely due to a flushed complexion or perhaps a fiery temper to match his possibly red hair, is different. It's not just the usual medieval scent of wood smoke and unwashed bodies. There's an added aroma of expensive perfumes, imported spices, and maybe just a hint of rebellion against the stuffy norms of the day. You see, Rufus's court isn't quite like his father's, the formidable William the Conqueror. Oh no, this court has flair. And not everyone is a fan. Imagine a great hall not dimly lit and austere, but blazing with more candles than strictly necessary. The light glinting off gold threads in elaborate tunics and the polished surfaces of long pointed shoes. Shoes so long and pointy, in fact, that some moralists of the time clutched their pearls or perhaps their rosaries, decrying them as unnatural and foppish. These were the crackles, or pigachis, a fashion statement so bold it was practically a declaration of independence from sensible footwear. It was said some courtiers even stuffed the toes with moss or wool to keep their shape. Try doing a quick dash to escape a charging boar in those, probably not ideal. You'd be more likely to trip and impale yourself on your own fashion sense. That's one way to go down in history, I suppose. Death by shoe. Rufus himself is a paradox. A brave and effective soldier, no doubt. He knew how to command an army, how to secure his borders, and how to extract a frankly astonishing amount of money from his subjects and the church. He wasn't just making it rain, he was causing a dynastic flash flood of florins, much to the chagrin of those being rained upon. But it's not his military prowess or his financial acumen that raises eyebrows, at least not in the way we're interested in tonight. It's his personal life, his companions, and the atmosphere he cultivated. Chroniclers of the time, men like Orderic Vitalis and William of Malmesbury, who, let's be honest, weren't exactly unbiased reporters, often having strong ties to the church, which Rufus frequently antagonized, paint a picture of a king surrounded by young men favorites who mirrored his own supposed tastes for luxury, extravagance, and other things. These chroniclers, our primary source for much of this, describe Rufus's court as a place of effeminacy. They talk of men with long hair styled and curled when short hair was the manly norm. They mention delicate fabrics, mincing gaits, and a general air of dissolute living. The term sodomite is thrown around with a vehemence that speaks volumes, though whether it speaks of actual observed behavior or is just a convenient damning label for a king they despised is part of the mystery. These monks weren't exactly TMZ, but they had their sources, probably involving a lot of eavesdropping behind tapestries and listening to disgruntled clergy. Rufus never married, nor did he produce any illegitimate children, which was highly unusual for a king of that era. Dynasties, remember, were all about heirs. His younger brother Henry, who would eventually succeed him, had plenty. Rufus's apparent lack of interest in women was in itself a scandal. Why would a king with all the power and resources at his command not secure his line? This lack of a wife or acknowledged mistresses fueled the rumors. If he wasn't interested in women, the medieval mind quickly jumped to the alternative. There wasn't a lot of room for nuance back then. You were either a procreating, dynasty-building monarch, or you were suspicious. One of the most prominent figures in Rufus's inner circle was Ranulph Flambard, his chief minister. Flambard was brilliant, ruthless, and incredibly effective at raising money for the king, often through methods that were seen as oppressive and sacrilegious, like keeping bishoprics vacant so the crown could collect their revenues. While there are no explicit accusations of a sexual relationship between Rufus and Flambard, in the way there are for later kings and their favorites, Flambard was certainly part of this criticized inner circle, embodying the kind of worldly, perhaps even cynical approach to power that Rufus seemed to favor. He was in essence the king's right-hand man, his enforcer, and his partner in fleecing the kingdom. "Dude, did you see how much cash Flambard squeezed out of that abbey?" One courtier might have whispered to another. The abbot looked like he was going to spontaneously combust. Historians still debate whether the harsh descriptions of Rufus's court and character were accurate, or if they were part of a smear campaign orchestrated by churchmen who felt slighted and financially exploited by him. He had a famously fraught relationship with Anselm, the Archbishop of Canterbury, a deeply pious and unyielding scholar. Rufus wanted the church's money and lands. Anselm wanted the church's independence and moral authority. They clashed repeatedly, with Anselm eventually going into exile. It's not a huge leap to imagine that chroniclers sympathetic to Anselm's cause would seize upon any rumor, any hint of impropriety, to blacken Rufus's name for posterity. Portraying him as a sodomite king was a way to suggest he was not just a bad ruler, but an affront to God. An odd and somewhat telling detail of the era was the cult of hair. Long flowing locks on men, sometimes even artificially enhanced, became fashionable in circles Rufus frequented. Moralists and clergy railed against this, seeing it as a sign of vanity, effeminacy, and a departure from traditional masculine appearance. Sermons were preached and dire warnings issued about men who looked like women. It seems trivial to us, perhaps, like arguing over skinny jeans versus bootcut, but in a society where appearance was so closely tied to identity and moral standing, hair length could become a battleground for cultural values. These fashion choices, condemned by the church, reinforced the image of Rufus's court as a place of decadence and deviance. Fashion so sharp you could poke an eye out or at least seriously offend a bishop. The end of William Rufus's reign is as dramatic and mysterious as his life. On August 2nd, 1100, he was hunting in the New Forest, a vast royal hunting ground his father had established. Hunting accidents were common, but this one was convenient. An arrow, shot by one of his own hunting party, Walter Tyrrell, struck the king and killed him. Tyrrell promptly fled the country. Was it an accident, or was it an assassination? Rufus was not a universally popular king. He had enemies, and his younger brother Henry, who just happened to be part of the hunting party that day, wasted no time. He rode straight to Winchester, seized the royal treasury, and had himself crowned king within 3 days. Talk about efficient succession planning. The circumstances of Rufus's death, combined with the chroniclers' tales of his unnatural life, led to a posthumous reputation that was deeply tarnished. He became a cautionary tale, the wicked king struck down by God's judgment. Whether he truly had secret homosexual relationships or simply fostered a court culture that thumbed its nose at convention and thereby invited the wrath of contemporary moralists remains shrouded. The whispers about him, however, set a precedent. Accusations of unnatural vice, often linked with extravagance and favoritism, would become a recurring motif in the stories of medieval rulers, a potent weapon in the arsenal of their enemies, and a tantalizing, if murky, hint for us centuries later, trying to understand the hidden lives within those dynastic walls. You can almost hear the forest floor crackle underfoot, the sudden twang of a bowstring, and then silence. The kind of silence that breeds legends and hides truths. Alright, let's drift forward a few decades across the English Channel and into a world of crusading zeal, chivalric ideals, and as always intensely complicated royal relationships. You're now witnessing the youth of two of the most famous names of the High Middle Ages, Richard I of England, the Lionheart, and Philip II of France, later known as Philip Augustus. Before they were rival kings locked in a bitter struggle for power and territory, they were something else. Something that has intrigued and baffled historians for centuries. Imagine them not as the grizzled, battle-hardened monarchs they would become, but as young men princes full of ambition and perhaps a shared sense of youthful rebellion against Richard's father, the formidable Henry II of England. Henry ruled a vast Angevin empire stretching from the borders of Scotland to the Pyrenees, and Philip, as King of France, was technically Henry's overlord for his French territories, a situation that was bound to cause friction. It was like having your much smaller but technically senior boss constantly trying to tell you how to run your massive multinational corporation. Awkward. In the late 1180s, Richard, not yet king, was often at odds with his father. Henry II had a complicated family life, to put it mildly. His sons were frequently in revolt, egged on at times by their own mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, a legend in her own right, but that's a story for another night. During one of these periods of filial discontent, Richard sought an ally in the young King Philip, and this is where the contemporary accounts get interesting. The chronicler Roger of Howden, who is generally considered a reliable source for the events of this period, tells us something quite specific and rather startling. He writes that Richard, then Duke of Aquitaine, stayed with Philip in France, and that Philip honoured him so greatly for so long that the King of England, Henry II, was astonished and wondered what this intimacy could mean. Howden then drops this bombshell, and King Philip loved him as his own soul, and they loved each other so much that the King of England was dumbfounded at the vehement love between them and marvelled at it. Okay. Vehement love is pretty strong language, even for an era that, as we've discussed, sometimes used flowery expressions for male friendship. But Howden doesn't stop there. He adds a detail that has fueled endless speculation, and they ate every day at the same table and from the same dish, and at night their beds did not separate them, and the King of France loved him as his own soul. Sharing a dish was a common medieval sign of intimacy or favour, but sharing a bed that's taking things to a whole new level of closeness, especially for two such high-ranking individuals. It wasn't unheard of for people of the same sex to share a bed for warmth or convenience in an age of limited sleeping arrangements, but for two princes, soon to be kings, with all the resources of their households at their disposal, and described in the context of such vehement love, it certainly raises an eyebrow, and possibly both. One imagines Henry II receiving reports from his spies, "Sire, about Richard and Philip, they're really good friends. Like, share a blanket and maybe whisper sweet nothings into each other's ears, good friends." Now, before we jump to conclusions and start shipping Filchard or Richlip, it's important to consider the context. Medieval chroniclers often used symbolic language. Sharing a bed could, in some interpretations, be a highly symbolic gesture of political alliance, a visual representation of their unity against Henry II. "Look, Dad, we're so tight we practically sleep in the same PJs." It was a way of saying we are one in purpose. Furthermore, the phrase, "their beds did not separate them," lectos enim eos per noctem non separabat, could be interpreted in various ways. Did it mean they literally shared one bed, or that their separate beds were in the same chamber, signifying constant companionship and trust? Historians still debate whether this passage from Howden points to a homosexual relationship, an intensely romantic but platonic friendship, or a calculated political display. The truth is, we can't know for sure. The medieval world had different understandings of intimacy and personal space. What we might see as overtly romantic or sexual, they might have seen as a profound but not necessarily erotic bond of brotherhood in arms, especially given they were united in a common political cause against Richard's father. It's like trying to decipher a very old text message that just says, could mean anything. Adding to the complexity, this intense closeness didn't last. Politics, as it often does, intervened. Richard became King of England in 1189, and he and Philip embarked on the Third Crusade together. Initially, their alliance held. They were brothers in arms off to reclaim Jerusalem. They even, for a time, renewed their oaths of mutual support. But the pressures of command, the rivalries inherent in such a massive undertaking, and their deeply competitive natures, soon began to fray their bond. It's like going on a road trip with your best friend. It either solidifies your friendship or makes you want to leave them at a deserted gas station. For Richard and Philip, it was increasingly looking like the latter. During the crusade, an odd fact emerges: Richard, known for his military prowess and fiery temper, was also a poet and musician. He composed songs, and some surviving lyrics attributed to him are quite beautiful. This artistic side is often overlooked. Imagine the Lionheart covered in dust from the siege of Acre, strumming a lute and composing a lament. It adds another layer to this complex, larger-than-life figure. Perhaps this sensitivity also played into the intensity of his youthful relationships. The canonical historical event here is, of course, the Third Crusade, 1189-1192. It was a massive, star-studded affair featuring not only Richard and Philip, but also the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who famously drowned on the way, which really put a damper on his crusading plans. Richard achieved considerable military success, defeating Saladin's forces in several engagements, but ultimately failed to recapture Jerusalem. During the crusade, his relationship with Philip deteriorated completely. They argued over strategy, over the spoils of war, and over Philip's decision to abandon the crusade early and return to France in 1191, leaving Richard feeling betrayed. Philip, back in France, promptly started scheming to seize Richard's French territories. So much for vehement love. It seems vehement land-grabbing took precedence. Once Philip returned to France, he became Richard's bitter enemy, and they spent much of the rest of Richard's reign fighting each other. Does this later enmity negate the possibility of an earlier romantic or sexual relationship? Not necessarily. Relationships, especially intense youthful ones, can sour dramatically. Or perhaps the love Howden described was always more a matter of political convenience, easily discarded when circumstances changed. The ambiguity remains. Richard did eventually marry Berengaria of Navarre, though by all accounts it was a political marriage, and he showed little interest in her. They spent very little time together, and the marriage produced no children, which again fueled speculation about Richard's sexuality, much like the situation with William Rufus. His mother, Eleanor, practically had to drag him to the altar. He seemed far more interested in warfare and in the company of his male companions in arms. So what are we to make of Richard and Philip? Were they lovers? Were they exceptionally close friends? whose bond was described in the effusive language of the time? Or was it a carefully crafted political performance? The image of them sharing a bed, eating from the same dish, united by vehement love, is a powerful one regardless of its precise nature. It hints at a depth of connection that transcends the dry accounts of treaties and battles. It reminds us that these larger-than-life historical figures were also young men navigating complex emotions and relationships in a world that was in many ways very different from our own, yet in others surprisingly familiar. The echoes of their youthful bond, however interpreted, still resonate a faint melody from a forgotten song. You're now easing into the early 14th century, a period where the air in England feels charged not just with the usual medieval aromas, but with a simmering discontent that's about to boil over. At the centre of this brewing storm is King Edward II, a ruler whose reign would become synonymous with disaster deposition and a rather grisly end. And at the heart of his troubles, or at least the most visible symbol of them, was his intense, all-consuming relationship with a Gascon knight named Piers Gaveston. Imagine Edward not as the strong martial figure his father Edward the Feat de Longshanks, the Hammer of the Scots, had been, but as someone different. He was tall and athletic certainly, but his interests leaned more towards rustic pursuits like swimming, rowing, thatching roofs. Yes, really, the king enjoyed thatching and associating with common labourers and craftsmen, much to the disgust of his haughty barons. He also had a penchant for lavish entertainment, and most controversially for showering inordinate affection and favour upon a select few, and Piers Gaveston was favourite number one with a capital F, and a blinged-out crown, metaphorically speaking. Their relationship began when Edward was still Prince of Wales. Gaveston, a knight of relatively humble origins from Gascony, a region in southwestern France then under English rule, was brought into the royal household possibly as a companion or model of knightly virtues for the young prince. If that was the plan, it backfired spectacularly, at least from the perspective of Edward the Foul. The two became inseparable. Chroniclers describe an immediate and powerful bond. Some sources even suggest they made a sworn brotherhood, a fraternitas jurata, a formal pact of mutual loyalty and support. This was a known medieval practice, but the intensity of their particular brotherhood raised alarms. It's like your dad hiring a tutor for you, and then you and the tutor decide to get matching BFFs, 4EV tattoos and elope. Dad might be a tad concerned. When Edward the Fair died in 1307 and Edward II ascended the throne, one of his very first acts was to make Piers Gaveston the Earl of Cornwall. This was a massive deal. The Earldom of Cornwall was one of the richest and most prestigious titles in the kingdom, usually reserved for members of the royal family. Handing it over to Gaveston, a foreigner of no great lineage in English eyes, was like giving your new boyfriend the keys to the family fortune and your ancestral castle on the first date. The established nobility were, to put it mildly, incandescent with rage. They saw Gaveston as an upstart and arrogant provocateur who monopolized the king's attention, affection, and crucially, royal patronage. Gaveston didn't exactly help matters with his personality. By all accounts, he was witty, charming, at least to the king, but also arrogant, flamboyant, and openly disdainful of the English barons. He reportedly gave them insulting nicknames. The powerful Earl of Warwick was the Black Dog of Arden, the Earl of Pembroke was Joseph the Jew, and the Earl of Lancaster, the king's cousin, and one of the most powerful men in the realm, was the Churl, or the Fiddler. You can imagine how well that went down at court. "Hey, Black Dog, nice weather we're having, eh?" Gaveston might have quipped, probably while wearing something offensively stylish. It's generally not a good strategy for social climbing to call the most powerful people in the room by names that suggest they're either rabid animals or untrustworthy characters from religious parables. The nature of Edward and Gaveston's relationship is, as always, a subject of intense historical debate. Were they lovers? The chroniclers of the time certainly hinted at it using terms like inordinate affection and lamenting the king's obsession. The Chronicle of Lanercost, for instance, speaks of the king being ensnared by Gaveston. The Vita Edwardi Secundi life of Edward II states that, "I do not remember to have heard that one man so loved another," and refers to David and Jonathan, that classic biblical example of intense male love. Some chroniclers explicitly accused them of sodomy. Others were more circumspect, focusing on the political disruption caused by Gaveston's unprecedented rise and influence. One of the key canonical events of this period is the drafting of the ordinances of 1311. The magnates, fed up with Gaveston's influence, the king's perceived misgovernment and failures in the ongoing war with Scotland, Robert the Bruce was running rings around the English. At this point forced Edward to agree to a series of reforms. A central demand of these ordinances was the permanent exile of Piers Gaveston. They declared him a public enemy, accusing him of leading the king astray, embezzling royal funds, and alienating the affections of the people from their sovereign. Edward, heartbroken and furious, was forced to comply. Gaveston was banished, but Edward couldn't stay away from his favourite. It's like that friend who keeps going back to their terrible ex. You just want to shake them. Despite the ordinances and the threats of his barons, Edward recalled Gaveston to England in 1312. This act of defiance was the final straw. A coalition of powerful nobles, including Thomas of Lancaster, Guy de Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, the Black Dog, and Humphrey de Bohun, Earl of Hereford, took matters into their own hands. They considered Gaveston's return illegal and a threat to the realm. What followed was swift and brutal. Gaveston was captured at Scarborough Castle. Despite promises of a trial, he was taken by the Earl of Warwick to Warwick Castle. There, after a summary trial, more like a pre-sentencing hearing, where the sentence was already decided, he was condemned to death. On June 19, 1312, Piers Gaveston was taken to Blacklow Hill, a piece of land belonging to the Earl of Lancaster, and unceremoniously executed by beheading. Some accounts say he was run through with swords as well. It was a shocking act of baronial overreach and extrajudicial killing of the king's closest companion. Edward was devastated and, according to some chroniclers, swore vengeance. An odd little fact surrounding Gaveston was his skill in tournaments. He was apparently an exceptional jouster, frequently unhorsing his opponents, which, while impressive, probably didn't endear him to the already resentful English knights he was besting. Imagine being a powerful established nobleman, proud of your martial skills, and then this Gascon upstart, the king's pretty boy, repeatedly knocks you off your horse in front of everyone. Salt meat wound. It added another layer to their perception of him as an arrogant show-off who needed to be taken down a peg, or several. The murder of Gaveston didn't solve Edward's problems. In many ways it deepened them. It created an irreparable rift between the king and a significant portion of his nobility, and set a dangerous precedent for using violence to resolve political disputes. While the barons might have hoped that removing Gaveston would make Edward a more pliable and normal king, it seems to have only hardened his resolve to favour those he trusted, regardless of noble opinion. The ghost of Gaveston and the king's profound grief and anger over his death would hang over the rest of Edward's reign. You can almost feel the chill in the air, the shockwaves of this execution reverberating through the kingdom, a grim prelude to further turmoil. The king's vehement love, whether platonic or erotic, had led directly to rebellion and death, a stark warning about the dangers of placing personal affection above the perceived good of the realm, especially when that affection challenged so many conventions. You're still in the tumultuous reign of Edward II, but Piers Gaveston, despite the king's enduring grief, is now a ghost, a tragic memory haunting the stone corridors of power. The barons might have thought that by eliminating Gaveston, they'd solved the king's favourite problem. Oh, how wrong they were. It's like thinking you've gotten rid of a fruit fly infestation by swatting just one fly. Edward, it seems, had a type powerful, ambitious, and utterly devoted to him, preferably to the exclusion of everyone else. And soon, new figures would rise to fill the Gaveston-shaped void in the king's affections and his political inner circle. Enter the Despencer's father and son, both named Hugh. Imagine the English court in the years following Gaveston's execution in 1312. There's an uneasy truce, a brittle peace between the king and the magnates who had taken the law into their own hands. Edward is biding his time perhaps, but he's certainly not a changed man. He still craves loyal supporters, individuals who will champion his authority against the overweening power of the great nobles, and he finds them in Hugh Despencer the Elder, and more significantly his son, Hugh Despencer the Younger. Hugh Despencer the Younger rapidly became the new focal point of royal favour, and with him the old patterns of resentment, jealousy and accusations began to resurface. If Gaveston had been a charismatic but ultimately foreign irritant, the Despensers were English nobles which in some ways made their rise even more galling to their peers. They were seen as betraying their own class, siding with the king against the collective interests of the aristocracy. It was like that one person in the group project who sucks up to the teacher and gets everyone else a lower grade, not popular. Hugh the Younger was by all accounts intelligent and capable, but also rapacious, arrogant, and utterly ruthless in his pursuit of wealth and power. He married Eleanor de Clare, the king's niece, which brought him closer to the royal circle and gave him a claim to vast estates, particularly in Wales. He and his father used their influence with Edward to expand their landholdings aggressively, often at the expense of other nobles, particularly the Marcher lords who guarded the turbulent Welsh border. Their ambition knew no bounds, and their methods were often questionable. Think medieval corporate raiding, but with more actual raiding and fewer spreadsheets. Oh, that strategically important castle and its very profitable sheep herds. Don't mind if I do, Hugh the Younger might have thought, while Edward nodded approvingly. The relationship between Edward II and Hugh Despencer the Younger quickly developed an intensity that mirrored and perhaps even surpassed his bond with Gaveston. Chroniclers again lamented the king's inordinate attachment. The Vita Edwardi Secundi describes Hugh as becoming the king's individual companion, and as it was said, his lord. It speaks of Edward being so seduced by the flattery of Hugh that he believed no counsel, and did no deed except as Hugh told him. Whether this bond was also sexual is again debated by historians. Some contemporary sources, particularly those hostile to Edward and the Despensers, certainly implied it, using the familiar language of unnatural vice. Others focused on the political corruption and tyranny that the Despensers' dominance seemed to foster. The political climate deteriorated rapidly. The Despensers' greed and their monopolization of royal patronage alienated a growing number of powerful figures. They were seen as even more dangerous than Gaveston because they were more politically astute and more systematic in their accumulation of power. They weren't just enjoying the king's favor, they were actively reshaping the political landscape to their advantage. This wasn't just about who got the best seats at the royal banquet, it was about who controlled the kingdom. This simmering resentment boiled over into open rebellion known as the Despencer War in 1321. A coalition of disgruntled Marcher lords joined by other magnates like the influential Thomas Earl of Lancaster. Remember him, the churl or the fiddler. He was still around and still very unhappy, took up arms. Their primary demand, the exile of the Despensers. They accused the father and son of treason, of usurping royal authority, and of leading the king and kingdom to ruin. It was Gaveston 2.0, but with higher stakes, and if possible, even more animosity. Initially, the rebels were successful. They rampaged through Despencer lands, and in August 1321 they forced Edward to formally banish Hugh the Elder and Hugh the Younger. For a moment it looked like the barons had won again, but Edward this time was not prepared to accept defeat so easily. Perhaps emboldened by a surprising victory against Lancaster at the Battle of Boroughbridge in March 1322, a canonical historical event that saw Lancaster captured and subsequently executed. A brutal turning of the tables, Edward recalled the Despensers. It's like the sequel nobody wanted, but the studio greenlit it anyway, because the first one, despite being a disaster, made a weird kind of memorable impact. With Lancaster, their most formidable opponent, out of the way, the Despensers returned more powerful and vindictive than ever. From 1322 to 1326, they, along with Edward, ruled England with an iron fist. This period is often described as a tyranny. Lands were confiscated, enemies were imprisoned or executed, and the Despensers enriched themselves on an unprecedented scale. Hugh Despenser the Younger, in particular, became the de facto ruler of England. He controlled access to the king, oversaw the administration, and directed royal policy. It was a period of fear and repression. If you so much as looked at a dispenser the wrong way, you might find your prize-winning pig mysteriously requisitioned for the royal good. An odd fact from this period relates to the dispensers' supposed use of sorcery. In the charges later brought against them, particularly Hugh the Younger, it was alleged that they employed magicians and dark arts to maintain their influence over the king and to harm their enemies. While it's easy to dismiss these as politically motivated fabrications designed to further blacken their names, it reflects the anxieties of the time and the belief that such overwhelming, almost unnatural influence could only be achieved through nefarious, supernatural means. It's the medieval equivalent of accusing someone of using subliminal messaging in their PowerPoint presentations. Historians still debate the extent to which Edward II was a willing participant in the Despensers' regime, or merely a puppet controlled by his powerful favourite. Was he a weak king manipulated by a cunning courtier, or was Hugh the Younger simply the instrument through which Edward sought to assert a more autocratic style of rule free from baronial constraints? The traditional view paints Edward as weak and easily led, but some revisionist historians suggest he may have had more agency with the Despensers, acting as loyal enforcers of his will. The intense bond between Edward and Hugh Despenser the Younger, whatever its precise nature, became the defining feature of this phase of his reign. It fueled the opposition, justified the rebellion, and ultimately contributed to their shared downfall. The echoes of Gaveston were undeniable. Once again, a king's passionate attachment to a male favourite, coupled with that favourite's arrogance and ambition, had plunged the kingdom into chaos. You can almost hear the sharpening of knives, both literal and metaphorical, as the nobles and even members of the royal family began to whisper that something had to be done, not just about the Despensers, but about the king himself. The pattern was repeating, but this time the ending would be even more dramatic and far more final. You're now shifting your gaze across the Channel to the glittering but often treacherous courts of medieval France. While England was wrestling with kings and their intensely problematic male favourites, the French monarchy, the Capetians and later the Valois, had its own set of anxieties and vulnerabilities, though they often manifested in slightly different, perhaps more subtly perfumed ways. The air here is thick with intrigue, the rustle of silk and the ever-present fear of a knife in the back, or perhaps just a really cutting remark at court that could ruin your social standing for weeks. While France didn't have quite the same dramatic rebellion-inducing sagas of royal favourites on the scale of Gaveston or the Despensers, in this exact period, the potential for scandal, for accusations of impropriety, and for the weaponization of sexuality was ever present. Dynastic survival in France, as everywhere, depended on legitimate heirs, strong alliances, and the impeccable, or at least perceived as impeccable moral standing of the royal family. Any hint of unnatural behavior, especially close to the throne, could be a dangerous vulnerability, an open flank for ambitious rivals or external enemies. Imagine the French court a place of elaborate etiquette, fierce competition for royal favor, and a constant hum of gossip. It was a world where appearances mattered immensely. A king needed to project an image of virile masculinity, piety, and just authority. His queen needed to be fertile and above reproach. Their children were dynastic assets. Within this rigid framework, any close, passionate relationships outside the expected norms, particularly same-sex ones, would have been deeply problematic. It wasn't just about sin, it was about stability, succession, and the very sanctity of the royal bloodline. Did you see the Dauphin spending an awful lot of time with that new lute player from Lombardy? They were composing sonnets. A concerned courtier might whisper the implication hanging heavy in the air. One of the most famous scandals to rock the French royal family in the early 14th century, roughly contemporary with Edward II's troubles, was the Tour de Nesle affair in 1314. This canonical historical event didn't directly involve accusations of homosexuality against the king himself, Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, a rather ironic nickname given his ruthless efficiency, but it shattered the image of royal marital fidelity and created a succession crisis. The scandal involved Philip's three daughters-in-law, Margaret of Burgundy, wife of Louis the Heir, Blanche of Burgundy, wife of Charles Philip's youngest son, and Joan of Burgundy, wife of Philip the King's middle son. They were accused of adultery, supposedly conducting illicit affairs with two young knights, Philippe and Gauthier d'Aulnay, in the Tour de Nesle, a guard tower in Paris. The fallout was brutal. The d'Aulnay brothers were tortured, flayed alive, castrated, and then drawn and quartered before being hanged. Public, gruesome, and designed as a terrifying warning. Margaret and Blanche were imprisoned for life. Margaret died in prison a year later, possibly murdered, or due to harsh conditions. Joan was also imprisoned, but later released largely because her husband Philip, the future Philip V, refused to repudiate her. The key thing here is the devastating impact on the dynasty. The legitimacy of any children born to Margaret and Blanche was now highly questionable. Louis VIII, who succeeded his father Philip IV shortly after the scandal broke, had a daughter, Joan, with Margaret. Her paternity was now suspect, and she was barred from inheriting the French throne, partly due to this scandal and partly due to the reassertion of Salic law, which forbade female succession. It's a stark reminder of how crucial sexual probity, or at least the appearance of it was, for dynastic continuity. If the queen or princesses were seen as loose, the entire succession could unravel. While the Tour de Nesle affair was about heterosexual adultery, the underlying vulnerability it exposed, the way sexual scandal could destabilize the monarchy, applied equally, if not more so, to any hint of same-sex transgressions. If a king was perceived as overly devoted to a male favorite, neglecting his queen, or failing to produce heirs, it wasn't just a personal failing, it was a political crisis waiting to happen. It could be spun by enemies as evidence of weakness, of being unfit to rule, or even of being under some kind of unnatural influence. Remember the dispensers and the accusations of sorcery. Similar fears could easily take root. An odd fact from medieval French courtly life is the elaborate nature of gift-giving. Gifts were not just casual presents, they were deeply symbolic, signifying favor, alliance, or obligation. A king might bestow jewels, horses, estates, or lucrative offices. The recipients of such largesse were clearly marked as being in the royal favor. If a king consistently showered one particular male companion with extravagant gifts far beyond what was considered normal or appropriate for his station, it would inevitably lead to whispers. Another diamond-studded codpiece for Jean-Pierre. The king must really like his conversation. Such conspicuous favoritism, even if not explicitly sexual, bred resentment among those who felt overlooked, and could easily be interpreted as something more by suspicious minds. Historians still debate the extent to which the French kings of this period, like Philip IV, were personally involved in or aware of the undercurrents of same-sex desire that undoubtedly existed within their vast courts and households. Philip IV, for instance, is better known for his ruthless suppression of the Knights Templar, which we'll get to later, and which involved accusations of sodomy and his clashes with the papacy, than for any personal scandals of this nature. He projected an image of cold, austere, and pious authority. However, the very act of policing sexuality so fiercely as seen in the Templar trials or the Tour de Nesle affair suggests an acute awareness of its potential to disrupt order and power. The atmosphere of suspicion wasn't limited to the highest echelons. Within the households of great nobles in monasteries and even in urban centers, the possibility of same-sex intimacy was a known, if often condemned, reality. The challenge for the French crown was to ensure that such behaviors, if they occurred, remained deeply hidden and never touched the sanctity of the royal person or the direct line of succession. Unlike in England, where royal favorites sometimes became powerful enough to openly flaunt their influence, the French system, perhaps due to a stronger centralized monarchy or a different political culture, seemed to keep such relationships, if they existed at the highest level, even more deeply under wraps. Or perhaps the chroniclers were simply more discreet, or their works haven't survived in the same way. The fear was not just internal. Dynastic rivals like the English were always ready to exploit any perceived weakness. An accusation of unnatural vice leveled against a French king or his heir could be potent propaganda in wartime, a way to delegitimize his rule in the eyes of his own subjects and foreign powers. How can you follow a king who, well, you know, it's the medieval equivalent of a political attack ad, and just as nasty. So, while you might not see the same overt dramas playing out in the French court records of this specific time regarding homosexual relationships of the king himself, the underlying tension is palpable. The Tour de Nesle affair, though, about heterosexual infidelity underscores the immense pressure for sexual conformity within the royal family and the devastating consequences when those norms were breached. The French court, for all its polish and sophistication, was a place where whispers could be as deadly as daggers, and the slightest hint of impropriety, especially of a forbidden nature, could threaten the very foundations of the dynasty. The silence on this topic in French royal chronicles of the era might not be an absence of story, but a testament to a more effective system of concealment or a more complete erasure from the record. You're now stepping into the hallowed yet often severe halls of medieval thought, specifically where the Church cast its long shadow over concepts of sin, morality, and law. It's impossible to understand the secrecy and peril surrounding same-sex relationships in medieval dynasties without grasping the immense power of the Church and the increasingly codified ways it defined and condemned such acts. The air here smells of old parchment incense and the faint, chilling whisper of damnation. Throughout the early Middle Ages, the Church's stance on same-sex acts, while generally condemnatory, based on interpretations of biblical passages like those in Leviticus or Paul's epistle to the Romans, was somewhat varied in its enforcement and the severity of prescribed penances. Penitentials, manuals for confessors, from this earlier period listed various penances for different sins, and those for homosexual acts could range from fasting to periods of exclusion from communion. However, as we move into the High Middle Ages, roughly from the 11th century onwards, you see a significant shift. There's a growing effort towards legal systematization, a desire to define doctrine more precisely, and a more organized and assertive church hierarchy keen on reforming society and enforcing Christian morality. It wasn't just about saving souls anymore, it was about structuring society according to divine law as the Church interpreted it. The Gregorian reform movement of the 11th century, which aimed to purify the Church and assert papal authority, played a role in this. As the Church sought to clean its own house, cracking down on issues like clerical marriage and simony, the buying and selling of church offices, there was also increased attention paid to sexual mores in general, both within the clergy and among the laity. The drive for a celibate priesthood, for example, inherently involved a closer scrutiny of all forms of clerical sexual activity. If a priest was supposed to be celibate, then any sexual act was a problem, but unnatural acts were often seen as particularly heinous. By the 12th and 13th centuries, theologians like Peter Damian were writing fiery denunciations of what he termed the vice against nature. His Liber Gomorrhianus book of Gomorrah, written in the mid-11th century, was a particularly influential and vitriolic attack on clerical sodomy, likening it to a plague corrupting the Church. While initially some church authorities thought Damian was a bit much, even Pope Leo IX initially hesitated to circulate the book too widely, perhaps fearing it would bring too much attention to the problem. His ideas gradually gained traction. He argued that such sins were not just personal failings, but were offensive to God, endangered the community, and deserved the harshest punishments. It's like he was the medieval equivalent of an internet troll, but instead of flame wars in comment sections, he was igniting fears of eternal damnation. The development of scholastic theology in the 12th and 13th centuries, with thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, further solidified the condemnation. Aquinas, in his Summa Theologica, categorized sins against nature, which included sodomy, masturbation, and bestiality, as being second only to blasphemy in their severity, because they violated the God-given natural order and the procreative purpose of sex. According to Aquinas, the unnatural vice is the greatest sin among the species of lust. This wasn't just one monk's opinion. Aquinas' work became foundational for Catholic theology. His reasoned, systematic approach gave intellectual weight to the condemnation, moving it beyond mere visceral disgust to a structured theological argument. It's not just icky, it's logically offensive to God's plan. The scholastics might have argued over their vellum manuscripts. This theological hardening was mirrored in ecclesiastical law. The Third Lateran Council in 1179, which we touched upon briefly earlier, was a key moment. Canon 11 of this council specifically addressed that incontinence, which is against nature, prescribing deposition and lifelong penance in a monastery for clergy and excommunication and segregation for laypersons. This wasn't some obscure local ruling, it was a decree from a major ecumenical council binding on the whole of Western Christendom. This is a canonical historical event that firmly embedded the condemnation of same-sex acts into the formal legal framework of the Church. Subsequent councils, like the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, famous for many things including requiring annual confession, continued to reinforce clerical discipline and the Church's role in policing lay morality. It's important to note that the medieval term, sodomy, derived from the biblical city of Sodom, was often a rather elastic category. While it most commonly referred to male homosexual acts, it could sometimes encompass a broader range of non-procreative sexual behaviors, including certain heterosexual acts, masturbation, or bestiality. However, in the context of accusations against powerful men and their favorites, it overwhelmingly pointed towards male-male intimacy. The enforcement of these laws varied. In some regions and periods, prosecution might be lax or focused primarily on clergy. In others, particularly when driven by zealous reformers or when such accusations serve political ends, as we'll see with the Templars or in discrediting rulers, enforcement could be terrifyingly severe. Secular laws also began to reflect these ecclesiastical condemnations. In many parts of Europe, by the late 13th and 14th centuries, sodomy became a capital crime punishable by burning alive. This was not a punishment to be taken lightly. The public and agonizing nature of such an execution was designed to be a powerful deterrent and a visceral demonstration of the perceived horror of the crime. An odd and rather grim fact is the trial by ordeal, which, while fading by this period in favor of more rational, though still often brutal legal processes, had, in earlier centuries, sometimes been used to determine guilt for various crimes. Imagine being accused of a sin and having to, say, carry a red-hot iron bar for a certain distance. If your hand healed cleanly, you were innocent. If it festered, you were guilty. While not specifically or exclusively used for sodomy, the underlying principle of divine intervention in justice underscored the medieval belief that God would reveal the truth of such hidden sins. Thankfully, by the time of Edward II or Philip IV, this method was largely obsolete in formal legal proceedings, replaced by inquisitorial processes and witness testimony, which of course had their own potential for abuse and false accusation. Historians still debate the precise impact of these theological and legal developments on the actual lived experiences of individuals who felt same-sex attraction. Did everyone internalize these condemnations equally? Were there subcultures or spaces where more tolerance or acceptance could be found, despite the official rhetoric? The evidence is sparse and difficult to interpret. What is clear is that the official dominant voice of the Church became increasingly loud, specific and punitive in its condemnation of same-sex acts. This created an environment where anyone, especially those in the public eye, like members of royal dynasties engaging in or even suspected of such relationships, faced not only social ostracism and political ruin, but also the terrifying prospect of spiritual damnation and increasingly horrific legal penalties. This formidable edifice of religious and legal condemnation is the backdrop against which all our stories of secret royal relationships unfold. It explains the need for extreme discretion, the coded language, the reliance on trusted intermediaries, and the devastating consequences when such secrets were exposed or even just rumored. You can almost feel the weight of that judgment, the fear of a God who, according to the preachers and theologians, saw everything, and a church that was increasingly willing to act as his enforcer on earth. You're now sitting in a dusty, candle-lit scriptorium or perhaps a grand chilly library in a centuries-old monastery. Around you are shelves groaning under the weight of massive leather-bound volumes. The air is still and the only sounds are the scratching of a quill on parchment, the distant chanting of monks and the occasional rustle of a page being turned with infinite care. This is where much of our information about the medieval past comes from. The chronicles, annals, letters and poems penned by individuals long dead. But how do we read these texts, especially when we're looking for something as hidden and controversial as same-sex relationships among the powerful? It's like trying to find a very specific needle in a colossal haystack, and the needle might be invisible or deliberately disguised as a piece of straw. The first thing you have to realize is that medieval chroniclers were not modern journalists striving for objectivity. They had agendas. Many were monks or clergy, writing from a particular religious viewpoint, often with a moral lesson to impart. They might be writing to praise a patron to justify a political action, or, as we've seen, to utterly demolish the reputation of an enemy of the church or their preferred ruler. When a chronicler describes a king as being addicted to sodomitical vices, as some did of William Rufus, you have to ask, is this a factual report based on eyewitness accounts or reliable testimony? Or is it a convenient and highly damaging accusation to level against a king who, for example, was constantly trying to extract money from the church and arguing with his archbishops? It's like reading a modern-day hit piece. You take it with a grain of salt or maybe a whole salt shaker. The language itself is a major hurdle. As we've touched upon, medieval writers lacked our modern vocabulary for sexual identity. They talked about sins against nature, unmentionable acts, effeminacy, or inordinate affection. These terms are frustratingly vague for historians. Inordinate affection could mean a king was showing too much political favor to one man, disrupting the established hierarchy. Or it could be a euphemism for a romantic and sexual relationship. The ambiguity was often deliberate. To be too explicit about such unmentionable sins was itself considered improper. So writers hinted, they alluded, they used coded language that their contemporary audience might have understood, but which can be opaque to us. It's like trying to understand inside jokes from 800 years ago. Good luck with that. Consider the case of Richard I and Philip II of France, and Roger of Howden's famous description of them eating from the same dish, and their beds not separating them. Howden was a contemporary, generally well informed. But what did he mean? Was he subtly hinting at a sexual relationship in a way that wouldn't overtly shock his readers but would still convey the unusual intensity of their bond? Or was he simply describing an exceptionally strong political alliance and personal friendship using the somewhat extravagant language of amicitia perfecta, perfect friendship that was common at the time? If he had written and then they totally made out, it would be easier for us. But medieval chroniclers just didn't write like that. Probably for the best, really. Can you imagine a medieval kiss-and-tell memoir? The Earl confessed, betwixt sips of mead, his undying passion for the stable boy. Then there's the problem of silence. What if a relationship was so well hidden, or the chroniclers so discreet or intimidated, that it simply wasn't mentioned at all? Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, as the old saying goes. This is particularly true when we consider female same-sex relationships, which are almost entirely invisible in these mainstream historical sources. The chronicles are overwhelmingly written by men about men and concerned with matters of male power, inheritance and warfare. Women's emotional lives, especially those that didn't fit the expected pattern of marriage and childbearing, were rarely considered worthy of detailed record. So if a queen and her lady-in-waiting shared a deep romantic bond, it's highly unlikely to have been documented unless it somehow created a public scandal or political problem, which would be by definition exceptionally rare. One of the canonical historical events that highlights the difficulty of interpretation is the sheer volume of accusations of heresy and sodomy that were often lumped together in the medieval period, particularly when authorities wanted to discredit a group. The Cathars, a heretical sect in southern France, were often accused of all sorts of immoral behavior, including sodomy, as a way to justify the brutal Albigensian crusade against them in the early 13th century. Were these accusations true, or were they propaganda designed to demonize an enemy? It's often a tangled mess of both. Once a group was labeled heretic, it became much easier to attribute any and every kind of unnatural vice to them. Historians still debate how to approach these sources. Some take a more literalist approach, arguing that if a chronicler makes an accusation, especially if corroborated by other sources, it should be given significant weight. Others are more skeptical, emphasizing the rhetorical nature of such accusations and the political contexts in which they were made. They argue for reading against the grain, looking for subtle clues, inconsistencies, or silences that might reveal more than the explicit statements. It's a bit like being a detective, piecing together a crime from contradictory witness testimonies and fragmentary evidence. You're constantly asking, what's this person's motive for saying this? What are they not saying? An odd fact about medieval manuscript production is the prevalence of marginalia, little drawings, notes, and doodles in the margins of texts, often made by the scribes themselves. Sometimes these can be quite irreverent or even R-rated, featuring grotesque figures, animals, playing musical instruments, or even explicit sexual imagery. While not directly providing evidence of specific royal relationships, these marginalia reveal a medieval world that was perhaps less prudish and more aware of the full spectrum of human behavior than the formal texts themselves might suggest. They offer a glimpse into a more carnivalesque, less censored mindset. It's like finding your very serious history professor's secret stash of Monty Python sketches. Furthermore, we have to consider the survival of sources. What we have today is only a fraction of what was originally written. Many documents have been lost to fire, flood, neglect, or deliberate destruction. It's possible that more explicit accounts or more personal letters that might have shed light on these relationships simply haven't survived. Or perhaps they were intentionally destroyed by later generations eager to protect a family's reputation or a dynasty's image. Imagine a king's loyal servant discreetly burning a packet of incriminating letters after his master's death. Such acts of historical tidying up undoubtedly occurred. So when you read about Edward II's inordinate affection for Gaveston, or the whispers about William Rufus's court, you're engaging in an act of interpretation, weighing the biases of the source, the conventions of medieval language, and the political context. It's a delicate balancing act. You can't simply take every accusation at face value, nor can you dismiss everything as mere slander. The truth, as is often the case, likely lies somewhere in the murky middle, hidden in the nuances of a carefully chosen word or in the deafening silence of a story untold. The challenge is to listen very, very carefully to the faint echoes from these ancient texts. You're now finding yourself in the early hours of Friday, October 13th, 1307, an ominous date, and for good reason, at least for one particular group. Across France, agents of King Philip IV the Fair are moving silently, executing a meticulously planned series of arrests. Their target, the Knights Templar, one of the most powerful, wealthy, and until recently respected military orders in Christendom. The air is thick with the chill of dawn betrayal and the dawning horror of what is about to unfold. The Knights Templar, officially the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, had been founded nearly 2 centuries earlier in the wake of the First Crusade to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. Over time, they had evolved into a formidable international organization with vast landholdings, castles, a sophisticated banking system. They were, in effect, the medieval equivalent of a multinational bank trusted by kings and popes, and a powerful military force. They were answerable only to the Pope, which gave them considerable autonomy. But by the early 14th century, their original purpose had somewhat diminished with the loss of the Crusader states in the Holy Land Acre. The last stronghold fell in 1291. They were rich, powerful, secretive, and perhaps a little too independent for some rulers' liking, especially a ruler like Philip IV, who was chronically in debt and notoriously ruthless when it came to consolidating his own power and filling his treasury. It's like having a very wealthy, heavily armed tenant who doesn't really pay rent and keeps telling you they only listen to your boss's boss. Eventually you might start looking for ways to evict them. The charges leveled against the Templars were shocking and sensational, designed to discredit them utterly. Among the list of accusations, which included denying Christ spitting on the cross, worshipping idols, specifically a mysterious head known as Baphomet, and illicit financial dealings, was the charge of institutionalized sodomy. The royal inquisitors claimed that new recruits were forced to engage in obscene kisses on the mouth, the navel, the base of the spine or buttocks, and were encouraged or even ordered to engage in homosexual acts with other brothers, with the rationale that it would bind them more closely together and prevent them from consorting with women, which might lead to them divulging the order's secrets. It's not a bug, it's a featured team building through ritualized debauchery. A truly twisted HR strategy, if the accusations were to be believed. Under torture, many Templars, including the Grand Master Jacques de Molay, confessed to some or all of these charges. The methods of torture were horrific. Stretching on the rack, burning of the feet, the estripade, starvation, sleep deprivation. It's hardly surprising that men would confess to anything to make the pain stop. Imagine having your feet slowly roasted over a fire until you admit that yes, you kissed your brother knight on the backside and worshipped a cat with 3 heads. You'd probably start making stuff up just to get it over with. The trial of the Knights Templar is a canonical historical event that reverberated throughout Europe. It lasted for several years, from 1307 until the order was officially suppressed by Pope Clement V, who was heavily under Philip IV's influence, residing in Avignon rather than Rome at the time, at the Council of Vienne in 1312. The Pope, initially hesitant, was pressured by Philip, who had already seized Templar assets in France and was eager for papal sanction. It was a masterful, if brutal, display of royal power over a supranational religious institution. Historians still debate the truth of the accusations against the Templars, particularly the charge of sodomy. Were they trumped-up charges a convenient pretext for Philip V to destroy the order and confiscate its wealth? Or was there some kernel of truth, perhaps some isolated instances of misconduct or unorthodox secret rituals that were then exaggerated and twisted by the inquisitors? The consensus among most modern historians is that the charges of heresy and widespread institutionalized sodomy were largely fabricated. The Templars, as a closed, all-male military order, living in communal barracks, might have had instances of same-sex intimacy, as would be likely in any such environment throughout history. However, the idea that it was a required ritualized part of their initiation or practice is widely discredited. The secret nature of some of their chapter meetings and initiation rites, however, made them vulnerable to such accusations, as anything hidden can be easily painted as sinister. An odd fact connected to the Templar trials is the legend of the curse uttered by Jacques de Molay as he was burned at the stake in Paris in March 1314. As the flames consumed him, de Molay is said to have cursed both King Philip V and Pope Clement V, summoning them to appear before God's judgment within a year. Whether he actually said this or it's a later embellishment, the fact remains Pope Clement V died only a month later, and King Philip IV died in a hunting accident before the year was out. Coincidence, or a really effective curse? It certainly added to the mystique and tragedy of the Templars' end. It's the ultimate "I told you so" from beyond the grave. The accusation of sodomy was particularly potent because, as we've discussed, it was considered a heinous sin, one that could taint the entire order and justify its complete annihilation. It played into existing societal anxieties about secret societies, unnatural practices, and threats to the established Christian order. By linking the Templars to sodomy and heresy, Philip IV could portray himself not as a greedy tyrant seizing assets, but as a defender of the faith, purifying Christendom of a corrupt and depraved organization. It was a masterful piece of political propaganda, a smear campaign of epic proportions. The interrogations, as recorded, show men confessing to a range of acts, often in contradictory or formulaic ways, that suggest they were coached or simply repeating what their torturers wanted to hear. Some Templars later recanted their confessions, protesting their innocence and the order's orthodoxy, only to be condemned as relapsed heretics and burned at the stake. The sheer scale of the operation, arresting thousands of knights across France simultaneously, and the systematic use of torture demonstrate Philip's determination. The Templar affair serves as a chilling example of how accusations of sexual transgression, specifically sodomy, could be weaponized for political and financial gain. It didn't matter so much if the Templars were actually engaging in widespread homosexual practices. What mattered was that the accusation could be made to stick at least enough to achieve the king's objectives. It also shows how a powerful independent group, once it lost its primary strategic purpose and became an object of royal envy, could be brought down by a combination of ruthlessness, propaganda, and the exploitation of societal fears. The image of these warrior monks, once lauded as heroes of Christendom, being dragged to torture chambers and accused of shameful kisses and worse, is a dark testament to the brutal realities of medieval power politics, where sin, or the accusation of sin, could be a death sentence not just for individuals but for an entire institution. You're now drifting south away from the often rigid monarchies of England and France towards the sun-drenched, politically fragmented landscape of medieval Italy. Here the air feels different. It's still medieval, of course. You're not suddenly in a Renaissance fresco, not yet, but there's a buzz of commerce, a cacophony of dialects, and a fiercely independent spirit in the powerful city-states like Florence, Venice, Genoa, and Siena. Could this environment, with its bustling urban centers, rich merchant families, and somewhat less centralized royal authority, though popes, emperors, and various dukes and signori certainly threw their weight around, have offered a different context for same-sex intimacy among powerful families, perhaps a little more breathing room or just different kinds of secrets. Unlike the large, relatively unified kingdoms of the north, Italy in the high and late Middle Ages was a patchwork of competing republics, principalities, and papal territories. Power was often in the hands of wealthy families. The Medici in Florence, though their major rise is a bit later than our core period, their roots are here the Visconti, and later Sforza in Milan, the Este in Ferrara. These families engaged in complex political maneuvering, commercial rivalries, and of course dynastic marriages to consolidate their power. While the Church's doctrines on sin and sodomy were just as prevalent here, Italy was after all the seat of the papacy. The day-to-day enforcement and social realities in these bustling cosmopolitan urban centers might have been subtly different. It's like comparing a strict rule-bound boarding school with a sprawling, chaotic university campus. The official rules might be similar, but the lived experience can vary wildly. Florence, in particular, later gained a reputation, especially by the 15th century, as a city where male-male relationships were relatively common, if still officially condemned and sporadically prosecuted. The Florentine authorities even established a special magistracy in the 15th century, the ufficiali di notte, officers of the night, specifically to root out and prosecute sodomy. The very existence of such an office suggests two things. One, that the behavior was prevalent enough to warrant a dedicated police force, and two, that the authorities were at least officially trying to control it. All right, lads, another busy night ahead. Giovanni was seen buying 2 sets of matching velvet doublets with young Lorenzo. Highly suspicious. Let's go ask some pointed questions. While our main focus is a bit earlier than the peak of the ufficiali di notte, the cultural currents that led to this situation were already swirling in the 13th and 14th centuries. Italian society, particularly in the urban centers, had strong traditions of male bonding apprenticeships, where young men lived and worked closely with older masters, and a highly developed civic culture that emphasized male camaraderie. These environments could potentially provide spaces for same-sex desires to be expressed, albeit discreetly. However, for powerful families, the dynastic imperative, the need to produce legitimate heirs to carry on the family name and fortune, was just as strong, if not stronger, than in the northern kingdoms. Marriages were strategic alliances crucial for maintaining and expanding a family's influence in the cutthroat world of Italian city-state politics. A failure to marry and produce heirs, or a reputation for unnatural vices that might taint the family honor, could be disastrous. So while there might have been a degree of de facto tolerance for certain behaviors, if kept private, public scandal was to be avoided at all costs. It's like that one eccentric uncle everyone in the family knows about, but no one talks about in front of the neighbors. One canonical historical event that touches upon the political climate of medieval Italy is the Guelph and Ghibelline conflict. This was a long-running, incredibly complex power struggle that divided Italian cities and families for centuries. Broadly speaking, Guelphs supported the Pope, while Ghibellines supported the Holy Roman Emperor. Alliances shifted constantly, and cities were often torn apart by internal factionalism. In this intensely partisan environment, accusations of all sorts, including moral failings, could be used to discredit rivals. If you wanted to bring down a powerful Ghibelline family, accusing its leading members of heresy or sodomy could be a useful tool in the Guelph propaganda arsenal, and vice versa. An odd fact about medieval Italian society, particularly in cities like Florence, was the importance of patronage in the arts. Wealthy families and guilds commissioned magnificent works of art and architecture, partly for civic pride, partly for religious devotion, and partly to display their own power and sophistication. While direct evidence of same-sex relationships being depicted or openly celebrated in the art of this specific earlier medieval period is scarce to non-existent, it becomes more complex in the Renaissance. The close relationships between patrons and artists, often involving young male apprentices in artists' workshops, created another social space where intimate bonds could form. These workshops were intense all-male environments. Historians still debate the degree to which Italian society before the Renaissance offered a genuinely more permissive atmosphere for same-sex intimacy compared to, say, France or England. Some argue that the urban, commercial, and somewhat more secularized in practice, if not in doctrine nature, of the Italian city-states allowed for a greater degree of personal freedom as long as public order and dynastic necessities were maintained. Others caution against overstating this, pointing to the continued condemnations from the Church, the periodic crackdowns, and the severe penalties that could still be applied. The key might have been discretion and social status. What a powerful noble might get away with in private was very different from what a common artisan might face if caught. Moreover, the concept of Florentine love, or Italian vice, which became more prominent in later centuries, was often viewed by outsiders from Northern Europe with a mixture of fascination and condemnation. It contributed to a stereotype of Italians as being more inclined to unnatural passions. This stereotype itself could be a double-edged sword, making Italy seem alluringly decadent to some while reinforcing moral panics for others. So, if you were a member of a powerful medieval Italian dynasty like the Visconti of Milan or the Este of Ferrara, and you harbored same-sex desires, your situation was complex. You were still bound by the Church's teachings and the absolute necessity of producing heirs. But the vibrant, often volatile social and political milieu of the Italian city-states might have offered different avenues for discreet expression, or perhaps just different ways for secrets to be kept and scandals to be managed. The walls of your palazzo might have hidden stories that were subtly different from those whispered in the drafty castles of the north. Perhaps a little more art, a little more intrigue, and a lot more depending on who your family was currently allied with in the latest round of Guelph versus Ghibelline drama. The Mediterranean sun might have warmed the stones, but the shadows of judgment and dynastic expectation still loomed large. You're now traveling further east, leaving the Latin West behind and entering the opulent, sophisticated, and often bewildering world of the Byzantine Empire with its magnificent capital Constantinople. This is the Roman Empire's eastern successor, a Christian empire with a distinct Greek cultural heritage, and it survived for 1,000 years after Rome itself had fallen. The air here is heavy with incense, the glimmer of gold mosaics, the scent of exotic spices from the Silk Road, and the whispers of intricate court politics that make the squabbles of Western European nobles look like amateur hour. What was the situation here in the courts of the Byzantine emperors regarding same-sex relationships and the unique figures known as eunuchs? Byzantium inherited Roman law, which had, by the time of Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, become explicitly condemnatory of homosexual acts, prescribing severe penalties, including castration and death, often by burning. Justinian's Code, a foundational legal text for centuries, famously legislated against unnatural offenses, linking them to divine wrath in the form of famine, earthquakes, and pestilence. So on paper, the official stance was crystal clear and extremely harsh. It's like seeing a giant "no trespassing, violators will be incinerated" sign at the entrance to a very fancy imperial garden. However, the reality within the sprawling, hierarchical, and deeply ceremonial Byzantine court was, as always, more complex. Byzantine society, while devoutly Orthodox Christian, also had a long memory of classical Greek and Roman culture, where attitudes towards male same-sex love had been at times more tolerant or even celebratory, though this classical tolerance was often a distant memory and not a lived reality by this period. Despite the severe laws, some Byzantine historians and chroniclers do make references, often veiled or condemnatory, to emperors or powerful figures who were rumored to have male lovers or to engage in shameful acts. One key difference in the Byzantine court compared to Western courts was the prominent and institutionalized role of eunuchs. Eunuchs, men who had been castrated often in childhood, were a significant feature of the imperial administration, the church, and the military from the late Roman period well into the Byzantine era. They could rise to positions of immense power: Lord Chamberlain, Praepositus, Sacri Cubiculi, Chief Minister, Parakoimenos, literally one who sleeps beside the emperor's chamber, patriarch, or even general. Because they could not father children and thus could not found their own dynasties, they were often seen as less of a political threat to the emperor and more loyal servants. It's like having a super competent COO who physically can't stage a boardroom coup to install their own family. The presence of a large number of eunuchs in close proximity to power, often in intimate roles within the imperial household, inevitably led to speculation and at times accusations regarding their sexuality and their relationships with emperors or other courtiers. Some eunuchs were known for their refinement, their patronage of the arts, and their devotion to the emperor. Others were feared for their ambition and ruthlessness. Their unique physical and social status placed them outside traditional masculine roles, and this third gender aspect, as some scholars have described it, could be both a source of power and a target for suspicion. Historians still debate the nature of intimacy involving eunuchs. While castration, generally, though not always, completely removes sexual function and desire as we understand it, emotional bonds, favoritism, and even physically affectionate, though not necessarily penetrative relationships could certainly exist. Accusations of eunuchs being effeminate or engaging in unnatural acts with other men, or even being the objects of an emperor's unseemly affection, do appear in some critical sources. However, it's often difficult to separate genuine observation from the political slander that was rife in the Byzantine court. If you wanted to discredit a powerful eunuch who had the emperor's ear, accusing him of some kind of sexual impropriety was a go-to tactic. A canonical historical event that highlights the turbulence and intrigue of the Byzantine court is the reign of Emperor Andronikos Sers Komnenos, 1183-1185. While not directly tied to accusations of homosexuality against Andronikos himself, in the way we've seen with some Western rulers, his reign was marked by extreme cruelty, paranoia, and a bloody overthrow. He was known for his scandalous youth, many heterosexual affairs, and his later tyranny. The brutal way he was eventually deposed and killed by the Constantinopolitan mob, tortured and dismembered over several days, illustrates the violent potential always simmering beneath the surface of Byzantine politics. In such an environment, any perceived weakness or unnatural proclivity in a ruler or his close associates could be exploited by rivals seeking to foment rebellion. An odd fact about Byzantine eunuchs is that some became celebrated saints and powerful church figures. Saint Ignatius the Younger, for instance, was a eunuch who became Patriarch of Constantinople in the 9th century and was known for his piety and administrative skills. This demonstrates that being a eunuch while carrying certain social stigmas and legal limitations did not necessarily preclude achieving high status and respect even within the church, which officially condemned the practice of castration though it often tolerated its results. It's a complex paradox. The act was sinful, but the person once a eunuch could still be holy or powerful. The sources for Byzantine same-sex relationships are like their Western counterparts, often indirect. We have legal texts, theological condemnations, satirical poems that mock effeminate men or lecherous old men pursuing boys, and passages in chronicles that might hint at an emperor's favoritism towards a particular male attendant or eunuch. For example, the historian Nikitas Choniats, writing in the late 12th, early 13th century, could be scathing about the moral failings of emperors and their courts, sometimes using language that implied unnatural desires or behaviors, though often wrapped in layers of rhetoric and moral condemnation. It's like reading a Byzantine gossip column written by a very disapproving moral theologian. And Emperor X was seen bestowing far too many silk robes upon young Eutropios, whose singing voice frankly isn't even that good. The empire is surely doomed. So if you were a powerful figure in Constantinople, perhaps even an emperor, and you had same-sex desires, the situation was perilous. The law was severe, the church was watchful, political rivals were always looking for an edge. Yet the very structure of the court, with its reliance on eunuchs in intimate positions of trust and its long tradition of imperial favor, might have created different kinds of spaces for emotional and perhaps even physical closeness between men. These relationships would have been shrouded in even deeper layers of imperial protocol secrecy and the complex linguistic codes of Byzantine Greek. The golden mosaics of Hagia Sophia might have witnessed many secrets, but they, like the carefully worded chronicles, are not easily persuaded to give them up. The whispers in the Great Palace were likely as subtle and dangerous as the famous Byzantine Greek fire, capable of erupting with devastating consequences if mishandled. You're now turning your attention to a silence that is often deafening in the historical record, the inner lives and personal relationships of medieval women, particularly when it comes to same-sex love and desire. If uncovering the secret homosexual relationships of medieval kings and male nobles is like searching for needles in haystacks, finding evidence of similar bonds between queens, princesses, and their female companions is like searching for a specific grain of sand on an entire coastline during a storm at night. The erasure is profound, rooted in the very nature of the sources available and the societal structures of the time. Imagine the world of a medieval noblewoman or queen. Her life was in many ways circumscribed by expectations of marriage, childbearing, especially the production of male heirs and dynastic alliance. Her body was often a political instrument. Her personal desires, if they strayed from this prescribed path, were rarely considered important, and certainly not something to be documented for posterity unless they caused a major scandal like the Tour de Nesle affair, which, as we saw, was about heterosexual adultery, but still highlights the intense scrutiny on royal women's sexuality. The chroniclers, overwhelmingly male, were focused on male lines of succession, male power struggles, and male achievements. Women often appear in these narratives primarily in relation to men, as wives, mothers, daughters, or pawns in political games. And the king married Princess Agnes, who was said to be fair and fertile, thus securing peace with the Duchy of Lower Slumber. Next chapter, the king goes hunting. This doesn't mean that deep emotional, romantic, or even sexual relationships between women didn't exist. It simply means they were far less likely to be recorded, and if they were, the language used would be even more coded or dismissive than that used for men. Society had fewer conceptual boxes for female same-sex love. While male sodomy was a named and condemned sin, often linked to fears of effeminacy and subversion of the gender hierarchy, female same-sex acts, sometimes referred to by theologians as tribadism or frication, were often considered less serious or even conceptually baffling to some male writers. Some argued it was less of a sin because it didn't involve the spilling of seed, a primary concern in condemnations of male sodomy, or because it couldn't result in procreation, which was the main purpose of sex. Others, however, did condemn it as unnatural. Think about the environment of a queen's household. It would be largely, though not exclusively, female. Queens, princesses, and noblewomen were constantly surrounded by ladies-in-waiting, female attendants and companions. In these enclosed, often intimate spaces, deep bonds of friendship and affection would undoubtedly form. Could some of these bonds have crossed into romantic or erotic territory? Almost certainly. But proving it from the historical record is another matter entirely. Letters between women, if they even survived, would likely be couched in terms of acceptable female friendship. Public displays of affection that might hint at something more would be unthinkable and would invite immediate censure. It's like trying to hear a whisper in a room where everyone is already expected to speak in hushed tones. There are very few, if any, direct unambiguous accounts of lesbian relationships involving queens or high-ranking noblewomen from the medieval period that are akin to the stories of Edward II and Gaveston, or even the insinuations about Richard the Ferns and Philip. The evidence, such as it is far more speculative, relying on reading between the lines of poetry, interpreting intense female friendships described in literature, or noting instances where women chose to live in close companionship, perhaps in religious communities or as widows outside the bonds of marriage. A canonical historical event that, while not directly about same-sex love, illustrates the agency and sometimes unconventional paths of medieval women is the rise of female monasticism and Beguine communities. Beguines were lay, religious women in northern Europe who lived in communities devoting themselves to piety, charity, and sometimes manual labor without taking formal vows or being cloistered in the same way as nuns. These communities offered women an alternative to marriage and a space to live and work with other women. While not inherently sexual, these female-centric spaces could have fostered deep emotional and supportive bonds, and it's conceivable that some of these relationships were romantic. However, such communities also faced suspicion and were sometimes accused of heresy or impropriety by church authorities, nervous about unsupervised groups of women. Historians still debate how to even approach the topic of medieval female same-sex desire, given the paucity of sources. Some scholars have looked to medieval romance literature, which occasionally features intense female friendships that could be interpreted through a queer lens, though this requires careful handling, as literature doesn't directly reflect reality. Others examine theological tracts that condemn female same-sex acts, arguing that the very existence of such condemnations implies the acts were occurring. If no one was doing it, why bother condemning it? It's like finding a very specific "no tap dancing" on the altar sign. Someone somewhere must have at least considered it. An odd and rather sad fact is the relative lack of concern in many medieval legal codes about female same-sex acts compared to male sodomy. This might seem like a form of tolerance, but it often stemmed from a misogynistic inability to imagine women as having independent sexual agency, or from the belief that sex without a penis wasn't real sex. This very dismissal contributed to their invisibility. If it wasn't considered a major threat to the social or divine order in the same way male sodomy was, which was seen as directly challenging patriarchal norms and the procreative imperative, then it was less likely to be prosecuted and therefore less likely to appear in legal records. When accusations were made, they were often vague or tied to other female failings like witchcraft or heresy. The idea of women bewitching other women into unnatural affections appears in some later witchcraft trial records, conflating same-sex desire with supernatural evil. So if you were a queen in medieval Europe, say Eleanor of Aquitaine, who incidentally was accused of various improprieties during her long and dramatic life, though not explicitly lesbian ones, in contemporary sources, and you found yourself drawn to one of your ladies-in-waiting, the secrecy required would have been immense. The language for your feelings perhaps unformed or unspoken even to yourself. Your primary duty was to your husband, your lineage, your kingdom. Any relationship that threatened that or even distracted from it would be perilous. The tapestry of your life was already woven with threads of political expectation. Adding a thread of forbidden love would require the utmost skill in concealment, and even then it would likely remain invisible to the weavers of history. The silence here is not necessarily empty. It's full of unwritten stories, lives lived in the margins of male-dominated narratives, and loves that dared not, or could not, find a voice in the historical record. You're now stepping back into the main arena of medieval power politics, a place where reputations were as valuable as castles and often harder to defend. We've seen how accusations of unnatural vice or sodomy hovered around figures like William Rufus Edward II and the Knights Templar. Now let's focus on how these accusations weren't just expressions of moral outrage or theological condemnation, but were often deliberately and strategically deployed as potent political weapons. In the cutthroat Game of Thrones, your enemy's alleged sexual proclivities could be the ammunition you needed to discredit them, rally support against them, and perhaps even destroy them. The air here is thick with slander, innuendo, and the gleeful sharpening of political knives. Imagine you're a disgruntled baron in England fed up with the king's favourite, who seems to have more influence than you, and all your ancient landholding buddies combined. Or perhaps you're a rival king looking for a way to undermine your enemy's authority before a major battle or during sensitive treaty negotiations. What's one of the most damaging charges you can level one that taps into deep-seated societal anxieties and religious prohibitions, and one that's incredibly difficult to definitively disprove? Accusing your target of sodomy was a medieval power move, a political trump card. It's like releasing a damaging, impossible to verify rumor about your opponent just before an election. It sticks whether it's true or not. The beauty of this particular weapon from a ruthless political operator's perspective was its multifaceted effectiveness. Firstly, it painted the accused as morally corrupt and an offense against God. In an age where religion permeated every aspect of life and kings were supposed to rule by divine grace, this was a serious charge. It suggested that the accused was unfit to rule, to lead, or to hold any position of authority. How can God favor a kingdom whose ruler engages in such abominations? Your propagandists might conveniently ask. Secondly, it often played into fears of foreign influence or social disruption. Favorites like Piers Gaveston Gascon or some of William Rufus's allegedly effeminate courtiers were sometimes portrayed as outsiders, corrupting the natural order of the kingdom. Accusations of sodomy could be linked to effeminacy, which in turn was seen as a sign of weakness, decadence, and an inability to fulfill the martial duties expected of a king or nobleman. It's a bit like saying your rival is soft or not one of us, stirring up xenophobia and anxieties about declining national virtue. Thirdly, if the accused was a king, it could be used to explain away unpopular policies or administrative failures. Is the king raising taxes? It's not because of a costly war or poor financial management. It's because he's lavishing wealth on his wicked, unnatural favorites. Are there famines or plagues? Perhaps it's divine punishment for the sins of the court. This tactic neatly diverted blame from systemic issues or genuine policy disagreements onto the personal and scandalous failings of the ruler and his inner circle. Don't blame the economy, blame the sodomites, a depressingly effective rallying cry throughout history. The case of Edward II is a prime example. While the intensity of his affection for Gaveston and later the Despensers was undoubtedly real and politically disruptive in its own right, the way this affection was framed by his enemies is crucial. The ordinances of 1311, which forced Gaveston's exile, didn't just complain about his political influence. They painted him as someone who estranged the heart of the king from his people. The chroniclers hostile to Edward repeatedly used language that hinted at or directly stated the unnatural nature of these bonds. This narrative helped to legitimize the Baron's rebellion and ultimately Edward's deposition in 1327. His perceived sexual transgressions became part of the justification for removing him from the throne. This is a canonical historical event where accusations of this nature played a significant role in the downfall of a monarch. Similarly, Philip IV's campaign against the Knights Templar relied heavily on accusations of sodomy and heresy to justify the seizure of their assets and the destruction of their powerful independent order. By painting the Templars as a secretive cult engaged in blasphemous and unnatural rituals, Philip could present himself as a champion of orthodoxy rather than a monarch defaulting on his debts and consolidating power. The more shocking the accusations, the less likely people were to question the king's motives. Historians still debate in each specific case how much of the accusation was true in the sense of reflecting actual sexual behavior and how much was pure political expediency. Often it was likely a toxic blend. A king's genuine but perhaps unwise favoritism could provide the kernel of truth that propagandists then twisted and amplified into full-blown accusations of rampant sodomy and corruption. It's like finding a single, ambiguous text message and using it to construct an entire narrative of infidelity and betrayal. An odd fact that highlights the pervasive nature of such slander is that even figures generally considered good or strong rulers were not entirely immune if they had close male friends, or if their enemies were desperate enough. For instance, while Richard the Lionheart's youthful bond with Philip Augustus is the most famous example concerning him even later in his life, his close association with certain fighting men could be, and sometimes was, commented upon, though rarely with the same level of overt condemnation as with Edward II. The line between celebrated brotherhood in arms and suspicious intimacy could be thin and easily blurred by a malicious tongue. The effectiveness of this weapon also lay in its vagueness and the difficulty of defense. How does one prove they are not a sodomite in a medieval court, especially if the accusers are powerful and the judges are biased? It often came down to a battle of reputations, witness tampering, or in extreme cases, trial by combat, though this was becoming less common for such charges among the high nobility. The accused was often fighting a fog of insinuation and moral panic. So as you navigate the treacherous currents of medieval dynastic politics, remember that words were weapons and accusations of sexual deviance were among the most potent in the arsenal. They could be used to rally opposition, justify rebellion, seize wealth, and destroy reputations. The fear of such an accusation, even if baseless, would have been a powerful incentive for discretion and conformity, forcing any non-conforming desires even deeper into the shadows. It's a stark reminder that in the high-stakes game of medieval power, any perceived vulnerability could be exploited, and the private lives of kings and nobles were never truly private, always subject to the scrutiny and potential malice of their rivals. The whispers weren't just gossip, they were carefully crafted political maneuvers. You're now drifting through the centuries, moving away from the immediate visceral reality of medieval courts and into the long, echoing corridors of historical memory. The stories of these kings, queens, and their alleged secret relationships didn't just vanish when they died. Instead, they were told and retold, reinterpreted and reimagined by subsequent generations of chroniclers, historians, playwrights, novelists, and, well, people like us, making late-night history videos. The way these echoes of rumor and scandal have shaped our understanding of the medieval past and of these individuals is a fascinating journey in itself. Imagine a game of historical telephone. A contemporary chronicler, perhaps with a bias, writes down an account of a king's inordinate affection for a favorite. A century later, another historian reading that account might interpret it through the lens of their own era's understanding of morality and sexuality, perhaps amplifying the scandalous aspects or downplaying them depending on their agenda. Then fast forward to the Renaissance or the Enlightenment, and these figures might be used as examples in philosophical arguments about tyranny favorites or the nature of kingship. Each retelling adds a new layer, a new interpretation, sometimes burying the original context deeper, sometimes shedding new light or at least a different colored light. It's like that one family story that gets more and more elaborate with each holiday retelling until Uncle Bob was apparently wrestling alligators while simultaneously negotiating a peace treaty. The story of Edward II and Piers Gaveston, for example, has had a particularly vibrant afterlife. Christopher Marlowe's late 16th century play Edward II is a canonical historical event in the reception of this medieval story. Marlowe writing in an era with its own complex attitudes towards same-sex love and court favoritism. Queen Elizabeth I had her own male favorites, though not with the same disastrous political consequences, portrayed Edward's passion for Gaveston as an all-consuming tragic love that ultimately destroys them both. Marlowe's play in turn influenced countless later depictions, cementing the image of Edward II as a king undone by his homosexual love. Whether that's a historically precise summary of a complex reign is debatable, but it's a powerful and enduring narrative. Remember that play about the king who really liked that one dude and then everything went pear-shaped? Yeah, that was Edward. Similarly, Richard the Lionheart's image has evolved. While his martial prowess and crusading exploits have always been central to his legend, the whispers about his youthful bond with Philip Augustus or his general lack of interest in his wife have been picked up by later writers and biographers, some of whom have more openly explored the possibility of his homosexuality. In some modern interpretations, he's become something of a gay icon, a warrior king who also defied conventional romantic expectations. This is a far cry from how his medieval contemporaries would have framed or understood his relationships, but it shows how historical figures can be reappropriated and reinterpreted to resonate with modern concerns and identities. The accusations against the Knights Templar also morphed over time. While Philip IV successfully destroyed them, the very sensationalism of the charges, the idle Baphomet, the secret rituals, the alleged sodomy, ensured their story would live on in conspiracy theories and esoteric lore for centuries. From 18th century Freemasons claiming Templar heritage to modern-day novelists weaving intricate plots around their supposed hidden treasure and secret knowledge, the Templars have become a byword for mysterious persecuted wisdom. The sexual accusations, while perhaps downplayed in some of these romanticized retellings, often linger as part of their dark, intriguing allure. It's like they became the medieval X-Files, complete with shadowy figures and unspeakable secrets. Historians still debate how to navigate these layers of reception and interpretation. How much does a 16th century play tell us about 14th century reality? How do we separate the historical figure from the legend that has grown up around them? It's a constant challenge to peel back the accretions of time and try to understand these individuals and their relationships within their own medieval context, rather than simply seeing them through the filter of later ages. It's like trying to restore an old painting, carefully removing layers of varnish and overpainting to get back to the original brushstrokes. An odd fact about the transmission of these stories is the role of popular ballads and folk tales. While often historically inaccurate in their details, these popular forms of storytelling could keep the memory of certain events or figures alive, sometimes in highly simplified or moralistic forms. A king known for a particular vice or a scandalous attachment might become a caricature in a folk song, a cautionary tale told around the fire. These weren't scholarly analyses, but they contributed to the general feel or reputation of a historical figure in the popular imagination. The silence surrounding female same-sex relationships in the medieval period has also had a long afterlife, an afterlife of continued silence for the most part. Because there were so few explicit medieval accounts, there were fewer hooks for later writers to latch onto. It's only relatively recently, with the rise of feminist history and queer studies, that scholars have begun to actively search for traces of these relationships and to ask new questions of the existing sources. This involves reading against the grain, looking for subtext, and acknowledging the limitations of a historical record created largely by and for men. So the echoes of rumor and suspicion that surrounded medieval dynasties didn't just fade away. They became part of the raw material for future storytellers, shaping how these historical figures were remembered, judged, and understood. Each era looks back at the past and tends to find reflections of its own preoccupations. The truth of these secret relationships remains elusive, often buried under centuries of interpretation and reinterpretation. Our own attempts to understand them are, of course, part of this ongoing process. We bring our own perspectives, our own questions, and our own fascination with the hidden lives of those who lived so long ago. The whispers from the past continue to intrigue us, challenging us to listen ever more closely. You're nearing the end of our journey tonight, back in that metaphorical candle-lit room, the tapestries casting long dancing shadows. We've wandered through drafty English castles, perfumed French courts, the sun-baked cities of Italy, and the golden halls of Byzantium. We've listened to the condemnations of the Church, sifted through the biased accounts of chroniclers, and felt the chill of political intrigue, where love, or the accusation of it, could be a deadly weapon. Now let's take a final look at this complex tapestry of love, power, and secrecy in the medieval world. What becomes clear is that medieval dynasties were not monolithic blocks of emotionless, power-hungry automatons, though some certainly gave that impression. They were populated by individuals with the same capacity for deep affection, passionate desire, and complex emotional bonds as people in any other era. The key difference, and it's a monumental one, was the immense pressure of dynastic expectation, religious doctrine, and social convention that shaped, constrained, and often forced underground any expressions of love that didn't fit the prescribed mold, particularly as we've seen same-sex love. The need for legitimate heirs was paramount. Dynasties rose and fell on the strength of their bloodlines, their ability to secure succession and forge alliances through marriage. A king who failed to marry, or who married but showed no interest in his queen and produced no children, like William Rufus, or, for a long time, Richard III, immediately became an object of suspicion and concern. His unnatural lack of interest in procreation, the primary and often in the Church's view, sole legitimate purpose of sex within marriage, was itself a deviation that invited speculation about where his affections did lie. It wasn't just that he wasn't doing his job, he was failing at the very biological imperative that underpinned his royal status. Talk about pressure to perform. "Sire, the kingdom needs an heir. Perhaps try thinking of England," his exasperated counsellors might have muttered. When this lack of interest was combined with intense public favouritism towards a male companion, as with Edward II and Gaveston, or later the Despensers, the situation became politically explosive. It wasn't just about the king's personal life, it was about the perception of misgovernance, the alienation of the established nobility, the siphoning of patronage to an unworthy few, and the fear that the king was being unduly influenced, perhaps even controlled, by his favourite. The barons didn't just dislike Gaveston because he was cosy with the king, they disliked him because he got the earldom they coveted, the power they felt was theirs by right, and because he mocked them while doing it. The love in these cases, whether platonic, romantic, or sexual, was inseparable from its political consequences. The necessity of secrecy for any same-sex relationship was therefore absolute, especially for those in the direct line of succession. This secrecy makes the historian's task incredibly difficult. We are, as we've discussed, often reliant on hostile witnesses, on chroniclers using coded language, or on reading between the lines of official documents. It's like trying to reconstruct a hidden room based only on the faintest outline of its door, an outline someone later tried to paint over. A canonical historical event that encapsulates the dynastic pressures and the potential for personal tragedy is the 100 Years' War between England and France, which began in 1337, not long after the deposition and death of Edward II. While not directly caused by issues of royal sexuality, the war was fundamentally about dynastic claim succession and the legitimacy of kingship. Edward III of England's claim to the French throne was based on his descent through his mother Isabella of France, daughter of Philip IV, and the very woman who, with her lover, Roger Mortimer, overthrew her husband, Edward II. The complex web of intermarriages, disputed successions, and the immense value placed on legitimate male heirs fueled over a century of conflict. In such an environment, any king who appeared weak or unnatural or failed to produce a clear line of succession was jeopardizing not just his own reign, but the future of his entire dynasty and kingdom. Historians still debate the true prevalence of same-sex relationships in medieval ruling classes. With a few scandalous cases we know about the tip of a much larger iceberg, most of which remained successfully hidden, or were they relatively rare? Exceptions magnified by their political repercussions, the truth is likely somewhere in between. Human nature doesn't change that drastically, but the outlets for its expression and the consequences of those expressions certainly do. Given the severe penalties and the immense social and political pressure, it's probable that many who felt same-sex attraction either suppressed it, lived lives of quiet desperation, or found ways to express it in relationships that were so discreet they have left no trace. An odd fact, or perhaps a poignant observation, is the medieval ideal of chivalric brotherhood and companionship in arms. Knights were expected to form intense bonds of loyalty and love with their fellow warriors. They fought together, often lived together on campaign, and swore oaths to defend each other to the death. This idealized homosocial world provided a culturally acceptable framework for passionate male friendship. While not inherently sexual, it's easy to see how, for some, these intense emotional bonds might have deepened into romantic or erotic love, hidden under the acceptable guise of knightly camaraderie. The line between a brother in arms and a lover could be a very fine one, perhaps crossed in the quiet of a shared tent on a cold night far from the judging eyes of the court. Revisiting these medieval realities, we see a world where personal affection and dynastic duty were often in stark, painful conflict. For those whose hearts led them towards forbidden love's life at the pinnacle of society was not a realm of freedom, but a gilded cage where every glance was noted, every friendship scrutinized, and every deviation from the norm could lead to ruin. The stories of William Rufus Richard and Philip Edward and Gaveston, the Templars, and the whispers from other courts are not just salacious gossip from a distant past. They are human stories of love, desire, power, fear, and the desperate need for connection in a world that often offered little room for authenticity, especially when that authenticity challenged the foundations of power. The silence surrounding so many other potential stories, particularly those of women, speaks volumes about who controlled the narrative and whose lives were deemed worthy of record. The medieval night was long, and it held many secrets close. As the candles burn low and the shadows in our room grow longer and softer, the vibrant, often harsh realities of the medieval world begin to blur like figures receding into a mist-laden landscape. The intense political struggles, the clash of armies, the stern judgments of the church all fade into a gentler, more distant echo. What remains, perhaps, is a sense of shared humanity, a recognition that even across the vast gulf of centuries, the desires of the heart for companionship, for understanding, for love in its many forms, were as potent then as they are now. The individuals we've journeyed with tonight, these kings and queens, nobles and knights, were not just pieces on a historical chessboard. They were people navigating a world that imposed rigid expectations and often offered cruel consequences for those who dared to step outside them. Think of them not just as monarchs defined by their crowns and their battles, but as souls who sought affection, perhaps found it fleetingly, and often had to shield it behind layers of secrecy lest their world unravel. The need to conceal, to live a life partially in shadow, must have been a heavy burden, a constant awareness of the precipice upon which they stood. Allow the sharp edges of their stories to soften now. Let the whispers of scandal and accusation fade into the quiet hum of the past. These were lives lived in all their complexity and contradiction, under pressures we can only dimly imagine. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you can feel a sense of empathy for those who sought love in a world that was not always ready to accept it, and a quiet appreciation for the courage it took to feel deeply in such unforgiving times. The night is drawing in, and the great heavy book of medieval history is slowly, gently closing. Rest now. End of script. Good night.